For most people, the story of Europe's first people feels settled. It is presented as a straight line. Hunters became farmers. Farmers became villagers. Villagers became civilizations. A slow, logical progression that textbooks compress into a few clean chapters. But what if that story is incomplete? What if the people we imagine as Europe's ancestors were not a single group, not even a single population, but a layered mosaic of peoples who arrived, disappeared, merged, and sometimes survived in ways we are only now beginning to understand? What if Europe's deepest roots were never as simple as we were taught? For more than a century, historians and archaeologists tried to answer these questions with tools they had at the time. Pottery styles, burial customs, languages reconstructed from fragments. These methods created powerful narratives, but also sharp disagreements. Some scholars argued for continuity, that modern Europeans descended largely from the continent's earliest inhabitants. Others argued for replacement, waves of newcomers repeatedly sweeping away those who came before. For decades, there was no final judge, until a new kind of detective entered the story. Not a historian, not a linguist, but genetics. Today, the central heroes of this investigation are not individuals, but entire disciplines, and the silent witnesses they study. Geneticists, armed with DNA sequencing technologies, began reading human remains not as bones, but as biological archives. Each genome became a time capsule, each chromosome a record of ancient encounters. Alongside them stand the real protagonists of this story, the long-forgotten populations of prehistoric Europe. Hunter-gatherers who survived ice ages, early farmers who crossed seas and mountains, pastoralists who rode across vast open grasslands. They left few written records, but they left something far more durable: their DNA. The first shock came when scientists began extracting genetic material from ancient skeletons buried thousands of years ago, from caves in Iberia, from river valleys in Central Europe, from windswept plains stretching toward the east. What they found did not match the old linear story. Instead of a single ancestral population slowly evolving in place, Europe's genetic past looked fragmented, almost chaotic. Distinct populations appeared, vanished, then reappeared in altered forms. Some groups contributed heavily to modern Europeans. Others left only faint traces, like whispers preserved in a few genetic markers. And this raised a disturbing possibility. What if Europe's first people were not the ancestors we assume? What if the earliest inhabitants of the continent are not, genetically speaking, the main ancestors of those living there today? To understand this, geneticists began treating populations the way detectives treat crime scenes, separating lineages, comparing patterns, and reconstructing timelines. One of their most powerful tools was lineage tracing. By studying specific parts of the genome that pass down relatively unchanged, such as paternal and maternal lines, scientists could track where populations originated, how they moved, and whom they mixed with. But DNA alone is mute without context. So every genetic discovery was paired with archaeology, stone tools, settlement remains, burial practices, and with climate data, ice sheets advancing and retreating, landscapes opening and closing. Slowly, a new picture emerged. Europe was not a cradle that produced one people. It was a crossroads. At different moments in deep time, the continent became a refuge, a destination, or a battleground, shaped by climate shifts that forced humans to move, adapt, or vanish. The people who first entered Europe during the Paleolithic period were hunter-gatherers adapted to cold, unstable environments. They survived for tens of thousands of years. Yet genetic evidence suggests that many of their lineages were later diluted, or even replaced, by incoming groups. Then came another transformation. Around 8,000 years ago, a new population arrived from the southeast, bringing agriculture. They did not simply introduce farming techniques. They brought new genes, new lifeways, and new social structures. This was not cultural diffusion alone. It was migration. Later still, another movement reshaped the continent again. Groups associated with vast steppe regions to the east, highly mobile and socially organized, spreading rapidly across Europe. Each wave layered itself over the last. Not cleanly, not completely, but enough to change the genetic landscape forever. What makes this story so unsettling is that none of these populations existed in isolation. They met, they intermarried, they competed, they absorbed one another, and in doing so, they created something new, populations that were neither purely local nor purely foreign. This means that when we ask, who were Europe's first people? We may be asking the wrong question, because first does not mean foundational. Some of the earliest inhabitants left surprisingly little genetic legacy. Others, arriving later, became disproportionately influential. And that challenges a deep intuition many people hold, that being first means being central. As geneticists continued comparing ancient genomes with those of modern Europeans, another pattern became impossible to ignore. Despite Europe's immense cultural and linguistic diversity today, many modern populations share genetic components that trace back to only a few major prehistoric sources. This does not erase regional differences, but it reframes them. Europe's identity was not built once. It was assembled piece by piece, through repeated encounters between very different peoples. And this is where the real mystery begins. If Europe's genetic foundations were shaped by successive migrations and mixtures, then modern identities, national, ethnic, even cultural, rest on far deeper, more entangled histories than borders or languages suggest. In the next part of this investigation, we will follow the genetic trail more closely, not through myths or maps, but through the molecules themselves. Because inside the genome lies a record of who arrived, who stayed, and who quietly disappeared, long before history began keeping score. To understand who Europe's first people really were, geneticists needed a way to separate time itself. Not calendar years, not archaeological layers, but ancestry. They found their answer in the structure of the human genome. Certain parts of our DNA change very slowly, passed down almost intact across generations. These genetic segments act like signatures, allowing scientists to trace lines of descent thousands of years into the past. Two of these lines became central to the investigation. One inherited through fathers, the other through mothers. Together, they revealed a story far more complex than any single migration narrative. The paternal line, passed through the Y chromosome, offered the first major clue. When researchers compared Y chromosome markers from ancient European skeletons with those of modern populations, they noticed something striking. The earliest hunter-gatherers of Europe carried paternal lineages that are now relatively rare. These men were among the continent's first long-term inhabitants, living through ice ages and dramatic climate shifts. Yet their genetic presence today is faint, not gone, but overshadowed. Then, around 8,000 years ago, the pattern changed. A new set of paternal markers appeared in Europe, spreading rapidly from the southeast. These lineages matched those found in ancient farming communities that had originated beyond Europe's borders. This was not a gradual cultural exchange. It was demographic replacement on a significant scale. The arrival of agriculture was accompanied by the arrival of people, families, communities, entire lifeways moving across landscapes that had previously been dominated by hunter-gatherers. But the story did not end there. Several thousand years later, yet another transformation reshaped Europe's genetic map. New paternal lineages emerged again, this time associated with highly mobile pastoral societies from the vast grasslands to the east. Their genetic signature expanded with remarkable speed, appearing from Eastern Europe all the way to the Atlantic. The implication was unavoidable. Europe's male ancestry had been repeatedly reshaped by migrations that arrived long after the continent's first settlement. But this raised a crucial question. If paternal lines show such dramatic turnover, what about maternal ancestry? This is where the story took an unexpected turn. Mitochondrial DNA, passed exclusively from mothers to children, told a different and more layered story. When scientists analyzed maternal lineages in ancient European remains, they found far greater continuity. Some maternal lines persisted across multiple population transitions, surviving the arrival of farmers and later steppe migrants. This suggested something subtle but profound. While male lineages often changed rapidly, through conquest, migration, and social dominance, female lineages were more likely to be absorbed, integrated, and preserved. In other words, population change was rarely symmetrical. Men arrived in large numbers. Women often remained. This pattern hinted at social structures shaping genetic outcomes, patrilineal systems, male-driven migrations, and the incorporation of local women into incoming communities. Europe's genetic history was not simply a sequence of replacements. It was a series of unequal mergers. The genome recorded these dynamics silently but faithfully. And when geneticists combined paternal and maternal evidence, a clearer picture emerged. Europe's ancestry did not come from one source. It came from at least three major population layers. First, the hunter-gatherers, Europe's earliest long-term inhabitants. Their genetic contribution persists today, but unevenly, stronger in some regions than others. Second, the early farmers, newcomers who brought agriculture and reshaped both the land and the gene pool. Third, the steppe pastoralists, later arrivals whose genetic impact was especially strong in paternal lines and closely linked to major cultural transformations. These groups did not exist in isolation. They overlapped in time. They shared landscapes. They intermarried. And crucially, they adapted to one another. But the genetic story did not unfold in a vacuum. It mirrored history's pressures. Climate shifts opened and closed migration routes. Technological innovations changed survival strategies. Social hierarchies determined whose genes spread and whose faded. This is why genetics alone cannot explain everything. A genetic signature might tell us that people moved, but not why they succeeded. To answer that, scientists turned back to archaeology. They noticed that genetic turnovers often aligned with major cultural transitions, new tools, new burial customs, new settlement patterns. These were not coincidences. Population change and cultural change moved together. Yet even within these broad patterns, Europe remained stubbornly diverse. Some regions retained higher levels of hunter-gatherer ancestry. Others showed stronger farmer or steppe influence. Geography mattered. Ecology mattered. Timing mattered. There was no single European genome. There never was. What we call Europe today is the result of repeated negotiations between incoming and existing populations, negotiations recorded not in treaties, but in chromosomes. And this reframes the idea of Europe's first people. The earliest inhabitants were not erased, but neither did they remain dominant. They became part of something larger, woven into a genetic fabric that continued to change long after their time. This realization forces a shift in perspective. Instead of asking which group founded Europe, we begin to ask how different peoples contributed, and how power, mobility, and adaptation shaped whose ancestry endured. In the next stage of this investigation, we will zoom in, not on the entire continent, but on specific populations where these genetic dynamics became especially visible. Because in some cases, the echoes of Europe's deep past are not subtle at all. They are written clearly, sometimes painfully, into the genetic makeup of living communities. By the time geneticists finished mapping Europe's broad ancestral layers, a new question emerged. If Europe was shaped by repeated migrations and unequal mixing, where could the evidence still be seen most clearly today? The answer was unexpected. Not in large empires, not in dominant cultures, but in smaller, often isolated communities. These populations became natural laboratories for understanding Europe's deep genetic past. Because isolation preserves patterns that large, mobile societies tend to erase. One of the most important concepts to emerge from this research is known as the founder effect. It describes what happens when a small group breaks off from a larger population and remains relatively isolated. Over generations, certain genetic traits become amplified, not because they are advantageous, but because they were present in the original founders. Europe's history is full of such moments. Wars, climate shifts, and economic collapse repeatedly fracture populations. Small groups migrated, resettled, and rebuilt, often cut off from their original genetic pool. In these conditions, ancestry becomes concentrated, and sometimes visible. Geneticists began identifying populations where ancient ancestry appeared disproportionately strong, communities that carried genetic signatures reaching deep into Europe's past. In some regions, hunter-gatherer ancestry remained unusually high. In others, early farmer lineages persisted with remarkable clarity. Elsewhere, steppe ancestry dominated. These patterns were not random. They reflected geography, social structure, and historical isolation. Mountain valleys, remote islands, borderlands passed over by major powers. In these places, the genetic echoes of Europe's first people were not diluted, they were preserved. But preservation came at a cost. Founder populations often show higher frequencies of rare genetic conditions. When the gene pool is small, traits that would normally remain uncommon can become widespread. For geneticists, this presented both a challenge and an opportunity. On one hand, these communities suffered disproportionately from inherited disorders. On the other, their genetic clarity allowed researchers to trace disease origins, understand inheritance patterns, and develop targeted medical interventions. In a strange way, ancient isolation became a modern scientific asset. But genetics alone could not explain why some populations preserved older ancestry, while others did not. To answer that, scientists had to look at social behavior. Many of these communities practiced endogamy, marrying within the group, sometimes for religious reasons, sometimes for cultural continuity, sometimes simply because geography offered few alternatives. Over generations, this reinforced genetic continuity. It also reinforced identity. In these groups, ancestry was not just biological. It was remembered through stories, rituals, and collective memory. And this is where the genetic story intersects with culture in a profound way. DNA can tell us where people came from, but culture tells us who they believed themselves to be. In Europe, some communities maintained a strong sense of continuity even as the world around them changed dramatically. Empires rose and fell. Borders shifted. Languages evolved. Yet these groups endured, often quietly. Their genetic profiles became time capsules. But there was another side to this story. Not all survival was peaceful. Many populations that preserved ancient ancestry did so under pressure, forced into marginal lands, excluded from political power, or pushed to the edges of society. Isolation was not always a choice. And genetics records this too. Bottlenecks, periods when a population shrinks dramatically, leave unmistakable signatures in DNA. Sudden loss of diversity, amplification of specific lineages, clear markers of survival against odds. Across Europe, these bottlenecks align with historical trauma, invasions, plagues, expulsions, economic collapse. The genome does not describe these events emotionally, but it remembers them precisely. As geneticists compared modern populations with ancient genomes, they noticed something unsettling. Some of Europe's earliest genetic layers survived most clearly not in dominant populations, but in those that history marginalized. This challenges a common assumption. Powerful groups often reshape culture, but survival reshapes ancestry. The people who endure quietly, adapt locally, and remain rooted often preserve deeper genetic continuity than those who expand aggressively. This realization reframed the idea of Europe's first people once again. They were not a single population that either survived or vanished. They were many groups, each responding differently to waves of change. Some were absorbed, some were displaced, some persisted, and some did all three at different times. What ties these stories together is not purity, but resilience. Europe's genetic past is not a tale of winners replacing losers. It is a record of negotiation between mobility and stability, between expansion and survival. And in certain populations, these negotiations left visible traces that modern science can finally read. But the story does not end with genetics, because identity is never inherited passively. People interpret their past. They choose what to remember. They build meaning on top of biology. In the final part of this investigation, we will step back from specific populations and ask a broader question. What does all of this mean for how Europeans understand themselves today? If ancestry is layered, mixed, and uneven, then what truly defines belonging? And how much of who we are comes from blood? And how much from the stories we choose to tell about it? By the time geneticists finished reconstructing Europe's deep ancestry, they realized they had answered one question and opened another. They could now describe how Europe was formed genetically, but they had not fully explained what that history means. Because once ancestry is revealed as layered, mixed, and uneven, a deeper issue emerges. If Europe was never built by a single people, then what defines belonging? To explore this, researchers turned their attention to the margins, not to the large, dominant populations that shaped empires, but to communities that did not fit neatly into the continental pattern. Groups whose genetic stories challenged simple definitions of origin. Across Europe and its periphery, scientists identified populations whose DNA did not align cleanly with their cultural identity. Some groups carried genetic profiles strongly shaped by local ancestry, yet preserved traditions, languages, or identities that connected them to wider historical narratives. Others showed the opposite: genetic continuity with ancient populations, but cultural identities that had transformed dramatically over time. These cases forced an important realization: DNA and identity do not always move together. Biology records ancestry, culture records meaning, and Europe's history is shaped by the constant negotiation between the two. This becomes especially clear when examining communities shaped by conversion, assimilation, or cultural adoption. In such cases, genetic ancestry may reflect one history, while identity reflects another. From a biological perspective, ancestry is cumulative. From a cultural perspective, identity is selective. People do not inherit identity automatically. They learn it. They practice it. They protect it. This insight reframes Europe's past in a fundamental way. The continent was never defined by a single genetic essence, nor by a single cultural lineage. It was defined by interaction. Migration did not erase identity, but it transformed it. Continuity did not require purity, but memory. When viewed through this lens, Europe's first people are no longer a fixed group waiting to be identified. They become a concept, a reminder that origins are processes, not moments. The hunter-gatherers who first entered Europe were not replaced cleanly. The farmers who followed did not overwrite everything that came before. The pastoralists who arrived later did not create Europe anew. Each contributed. Each adapted. Each left traces, some visible, some faint. What modern genetics reveals is not a hierarchy of peoples, but a chronology of encounters. And this carries an important implication. Modern Europeans are not descendants of a single past, but heirs to many pasts at once. This does not weaken identity. It deepens it. Understanding ancestry as layered does not erase difference, it explains it. Regional variation, cultural diversity, and even historical conflict begin to make sense when viewed as outcomes of long-term interaction rather than isolated origins. And perhaps most importantly, this perspective dissolves a powerful myth: the idea that being first grants ownership. Genetics shows no such privilege. Early arrival does not guarantee genetic dominance. Later arrival does not imply displacement alone. What matters is integration: who mixed, who adapted, and who endured. Europe's past is written not in clean lines, but in overlaps. And those overlaps are still present today, in genomes, in languages, in traditions that carry fragments of much older worlds. This is why modern DNA research has such emotional impact. It does more than reconstruct history. It unsettles certainty. It forces people to reconsider narratives they inherited, national, ethnic, even personal. When people discover that their ancestry reflects multiple ancient populations, the question shifts. Not where do I really come from, but how many stories live inside me? The answer for most Europeans is many. And this realization brings us to the heart of the matter. Identity is not a fixed biological category. It is a dialogue between inheritance and interpretation, between what was passed down biologically and what was preserved culturally, between chromosomes and memory. Europe's first people did not disappear. They became part of something larger than themselves, and so did everyone who followed. The continent's true foundation is not a population, but a pattern of movement, mixture, survival, and meaning-making that continues to this day. In the end, the most honest conclusion genetics offers is also the most human. History is not written only in books. It is written in bodies. And every genome is a library, filled with chapters from lives long forgotten, yet never fully gone. To understand Europe's origins, then, is not to search for a single beginning. It is to accept that the past lives on, not as a single truth, but as a shared inheritance.